Good morning. It's very nice to be with you. Thank you, Brother Ted and Pueblo West Baptist. Every year I think it'll be the last year I'm invited, so I'll try again this year. No, I love being here. I really appreciate the opportunity to bring church history. I love church history, and there's not lots of opportunities, and this is one. Let me set this up. This is my timer. This is your best friend, and we will dig in. Now, I do have a paper out there. What I'm going to cover, I'm really going to rush through this and really just dip my toe in the water. But there's a lot more detail in the paper that I've provided if you're interested in this subject. Maybe I get done and you're like, no, thank you. But I want to talk about marriage historically. I want to look at several marriages in the past. As Brother Ted said, they're not perfect marriages. These aren't perfect people. But the Lord does give us some wonderful examples. One of the things I'll just mention right now, the marriages I'm going to look at are the marriages of vocational pastors and their wives. And one might say, well, this doesn't really apply to us, but the fact is that in principle, everything that was operative in their marriages that was good and biblical applies to every one of us, whatever our vocation. And so that's something important to remember. Around 1642, Puritan poet Anne Bradstreet wrote a poem about her husband called "To My Dear and Loving Husband." It's a beautiful poem. She had a very exalted view of marriage. In fact, she says that marriage is something of a foretaste of heaven itself. And it might surprise you to discover that that was not a common view throughout the history of the church. That was something of a remarkable view. Even in her own age, even in the 16th and 17th centuries, there were many people that wrote many things about marriage that were not positive. For example, German humanist Sebastian Frank wrote, "If you find life going too well, take a wife." Others declared a plain country bridegroom shakes hands with everyone he meets as if he were now preparing for a condemned man's voyage. Others would say to their friend, "Our gallant friend has gone to the church on his wedding day as martyrs to the fire." Or they would have witty little sayings like, "Winter and wedlock tame both man and beast," or "Wedlock is padlock," or "A married man turns his staff into a stake. He used to be able to roam freely and now he's tied down." And you have to ask, well, why was there such widespread dissatisfaction with the institution of marriage? And I wouldn't necessarily say it was dissatisfaction. It was the view that marriage was second best. In the Catholic Council of Trent in 1545, which was called in response to Protestantism, it was the largest and most important Roman Catholic council ever, one of the canons that came out of that council declared that if anyone says that marriage is superior for anybody to virginity or celibacy, let him be anathema. In 1598, the Roman Catholic Cardinal Bellarmine, who was a constant opponent of the Reformation, wrote a catechism for Catholics, and in it he wrote this: "Marriage is a thing human, virginity is angelical. Marriage is according to nature, virginity is a thing above nature." And you might ask, well, where in the 16th and 17th century did they get this idea? Well, it had started long before, in the writings of Jerome, St. Jerome, and Ambrose, and Augustine, and Aquinas, and really almost the totality of great medieval theologians declared that marriage was second best. It was second best to celibacy and virginity. And Martin Luther, who was a Roman Catholic monk early in his life, later commenting on Genesis 2, chapter 2, said this. He says, "When I was a boy, marriage was considered so infamous on account of impious and impure celibacy that I thought I could not think about married life without sin. For all were convinced that if anyone wished to live a life holy and acceptable to God, he must never become a spouse, but must live a celibate and take the vow of celibacy." Protestants broke this view. Protestants said, no, that is not true. Now, Protestants weren't always agreed, early Protestants, whether we're talking about the Reformers or the Puritans or the heirs of the Puritans, they weren't always agreed on exactly in substance what marriage was. Some thought it was a sacrament. Luther did early on. Some thought a covenant, some a contract, a commonwealth, a social estate. They would describe it differently. And there were very nuanced differences, but what they uniformly agreed on, all Protestants, is that marriage was instituted by God. It was a glorious institution, and it ought to be held in honor by all people. And furthermore, it had an end, as Drew has helped us learn in the last number of days. There was an end to marriage. What was the end? And there was a number of them. Companionship, procreation. It was a bulwark against sexual sin. And as Drew said, it also points us to Christ and his relationship with his church. And so what I would like to do this morning is focus specifically, hone in on this idea of companionship, and just sort of sample what companionship looked like in various marriages across a number of centuries. But this idea of companionship is biblical. Solomon wasn't writing explicitly about marriage, but he told us about the importance of companionship, and surely that would include companionship in marriage. In Ecclesiastes 4, starting in verse 9, when he wrote this, "Two are better than one, because they have a good reward for their labor." I want you to hang on to that when we're going through these marriages. The reward or return for the labor of two, rather than the labor performed by, or the reward or return on an individual's labor. And that becomes a central theme in many of these marriages. But Solomon goes on, he says, "For if they fall, the one will lift up his fellow. But woe to him that is alone when he falleth, for he hath not another to help him up. Again, if two lie together, they shall have heat. But how can one be warm alone? And if one prevail against him, two shall withstand him, and a threefold cord is not quickly broken." And this idea of companionship became central in marriage in Protestantism, which was a serious break from the Roman Catholic view of marriage. And Protestants across the board spoke glowingly of marriage. They held it in very high esteem. And so what I want to do now is I want to look at three marriages in particular. The marriage of Martin and Katharina Luther, 16th century, the marriage of Richard and Margaret Baxter, 17th century, and the marriage of Charles and Susanna Spurgeon, 19th century. There's others I could have added, and by the way, not all Protestant marriages in history were good. Somebody mentioned the Wesleys. If I'm not mistaken, John Wesley and his wife did not have a good marriage, and so they weren't all good. And these weren't perfect marriages, but they provided some wonderful insights into marriage, and they were wonderful in many ways, and I'd like to bring some of that out. So let's start with Luther and his wife Katharina. Luther's story is a familiar one. I don't want to spend much time going into it. He was a Catholic monk. He was plagued with the idea of the righteousness of God because he knew that the righteousness of God meant his condemnation. In 1513, he starts lecturing through the Bible. He lectures first through the Psalms. I think that warmed him up to what he would encounter in Romans. He comes to Romans. He gets to Romans 1, 16 and 17 about the righteousness of God revealed. And Luther struggled mightily with that until he understood that the righteousness that's revealed is God's righteousness, which he grants us by faith. The gospel. He understood the gospel, and he says it was as though I were reborn. And so this no-name monk in this no-name part of Germany, in Wittenberg, Germany, nobody knew who Luther was, is reborn because he understood the gospel, and little did anybody know that it would set the world on fire. In 1517, he published his famous 95 Theses. It was a tract, an attack on the indulgence sales in the church, in the Roman church. More importantly, 1520, he wrote several works, The Babylonian Captivity of the Church, where he attacked the 7 sacraments of the Catholic Church, saying there's only 2. He wrote the Address to the German Nobility, which was an appeal to German nobles to reform the church in Germany because Rome wouldn't. And he wrote The Freedom of a Christian. Well, the result of writing these works and other things Luther was doing, he found himself outside the church. He was excommunicated in 1520. There's another work the next year that very few people know he wrote. It's called Judgment on Monastic Vows. And in that work, he assails the vows of poverty and chastity and obedience. He really assailed monasticism and convents and monasteries across Europe. And somehow, nobody's quite sure exactly how this happened, but these works of Luther, both those works I formerly mentioned, as well as this particular work, found their way into a Cistercian monastery in Nimschen, Germany, about 100 miles south of Wittenberg, where Luther lived, and found their way into the hands of a number of nuns, including Katharina von Bora, a young nun who had been in the convent since she was 6 years old. And Katharina and her fellow nuns, some of them anyway, understood the gospel, gave their lives to the Lord, rejected monastic vows, and oddly enough, having never known, Luther had no idea who these women were, but he still helped these women escape from the convent in 1523, and they made their way to Wittenberg. Now, the prospects for nuns who had escaped convents were not good. If you got caught, you'd be returned, and the penalties were severe. If you weren't caught, you only had a limited number of options. You could be returned to your family if they could afford to have you, which in many cases was not the case. If you might be able to find a husband, possibly. If you were beyond childbearing age, you were in deep trouble. And if you couldn't find a husband or return home, you'd be destitute and probably die at a very early age. You just couldn't survive. Well, Luther, with the help of his friends, manages to marry off just about every one of these nuns, or gets them home, those he could get home. But that wasn't an option for Katharina. Her father had paid something called a cloister dowry, which said he paid a sufficient amount of funds to the cloister that it would ensure that Katharina would be there the rest of her life. So his responsibility, he was absolved of all responsibility. And, in fact, nobody actually knows if he was alive in 1523. So that option was off the table. So Luther tried to find her a husband. He couldn't. And then Katharina did the unthinkable. She asked Martin Luther to marry her. Well, Martin Luther, for his part, he had no interest in marriage. For his part, he was writing and speaking prolifically on marriage even earlier, as early as 1519. But he had a very high view of marriage. Luther said this, for example, in his sermon on Hebrews 13:4, let marriage be held in honor by all. He said this: the first thing one should learn concerning this estate of marriage is this: matrimony has been ordained and established by God. This is about the most difficult thing in married life, namely, that one should learn to look upon this estate according to its highest honor, that it is God's institution and rests upon God's word. That might strike you as odd. Luther is saying the most difficult thing in marriage is to recognize that this is an institution established by God. Now, let me just ask you, how many of you think that marriage is an institution established by God? Raise your hand. Everybody, basically. Okay. Not that hard to believe. But Luther clarifies. He says, it is indeed not difficult to learn the words that marriage is an estate established by God. But the difficulty to which I refer is this: that one be sure about this and feel no doubt, and that one look upon his own marriage and that of others everywhere as effected, ordered, sent, and, as we say, provided by God. For the mad world, and also prudent reason, do not take the matter seriously, but think it is a matter of chance or accident that one should get this or that person. You know what Luther says? He says the most difficult thing about marriage and understanding marriage rightly is not that we would say it's established by God, it's God's institution, but to say my marriage is established by God. This is what God designed. My wife was designed for me, and I for her, and there's no one else, and never has been, and never will be. That's what Luther says, to feel that in your bones, that's what marriage is. Oh, it's easy to say God established marriage. Yeah, that's an easy thing to say. Do you believe it about your marriage? That's what Luther says is hard. He goes on. He says, everyone should look upon his or her spouse as the only one, and that there were not another upon the earth, and that no king in all his adornment, yea, not even the sun, should in his eyes shine and glow more beautifully. If God gave me my wife, that is a gift from God. If God gave me to my wife and my wife to me, that is a gift from God designed for me and for her specifically, and it's the most glorious thing in the world. That's what Luther says. He says marriage is nothing less than a holy and divine companionship. He says the same thing in his 1522 on the estate of marriage. He also adds this. He says, many have wives, but few find wives. Why, he asks? They are blind. They fail to see that their life and conduct with their wives is the work of God and pleasing in his sight. And so Luther had this exalted view of marriage. But he wasn't interested in marrying, and you might say, well, that's hypocritical maybe. If it's this great estate and this wonderful institution, why not marry? Well, Luther tells us, he writes to a friend, Spalatin, George Spalatin, who was a fellow reformer, and he writes this in 1524. He writes this letter in 1524, and one of the reasons he gives for not wanting to get married is, I daily expect to die a heretic's death. I daily expect to be killed as a heretic. That's the reason I don't want to get married. 5 months later, in April 16th, 1525, he writes again to Spalatin. Spalatin was considering marriage, and he's sort of dragging his feet, and so Luther, in his humorous style, writes to Spalatin, and he says this, I do not want you to wonder that a famous lover like me does not marry. It is rather strange that I, who so often write about matrimony and get mixed up with women, have not yet turned into a woman, to say nothing of not marrying one. And then he says this to encourage his friend. He says, because Spalatin's dragging his feet on marrying one woman, Luther says, yet if you want me to set an example, look, here you have a most powerful one. I have had 3 wives simultaneously and loved them so much that I've lost 2 to other husbands. And the third I can hardly keep with my left arm, and no doubt she will probably soon be snatched away from me. But you are a sluggish lover who does not dare to become the husband of even one woman. He's encouraging his friend who's dragging his feet on marriage. He's like, I have 3 wives. You need to go forward with just one. Of course, he wasn't married and didn't have 3 wives. He's playing. But then he adds this line, which is, in retrospect, shocking probably for Luther. He says, watch out that I, who have no thought of marriage at all, do not someday overtake you, just as God usually does those things that are least expected. He tells his friend, if you keep being sluggish about this, even I am liable to overtake you in marriage. I might get married before you. Well, less than a month later, he writes to a friend and indicated that he'd married Katerina von Bora, something he didn't expect 3 weeks earlier. And here's his reason. It was a good reason. To please his father, rile the Pope, cause the angels to laugh and the devils to weep. To his good friend Nicholas von Amsdorf, Luther wrote, I feel neither passion nor burning love for my spouse. He had no affection for her. That's not why he married her. He wasn't driven by affection or passion or the desire to have children or to try a bulwark against sexual sin. He didn't marry for any of those reasons. He tells some students gathered at his table 13 years later, at his table talk, he would have these students around, and his wife was there, Katie. He said, if I'd wanted to get married 13 years ago, I would have chosen Eva Schoenfeld. I mean, who says this in front of your wife? But he does. He says, I didn't love my Katie at the time. I regarded her with mistrust as someone proud and arrogant. But it pleased God who wanted me to take pity upon her. In fact, they got married. They had probably never had a meaningful conversation before they got married. So here's why this marriage in particular is really remarkable. First, later Puritans and even reformers would write about how to choose a wife, and everybody would say Luther was mad. He's crazy, except Luther believed that God gave him Katrina. God compelled him, as it were, with this Christian duty to care for this sister who was going to be destitute. And so he married her out of Christian compassion, believing God designed it that way. And she married him because she knew she had no other options, but she believed God designed it that way. And they had this deeply rooted belief that every marriage, including theirs, was specifically designed that way. So the one thing they had going for them is they believed that God gave each to the other. And that was an unshakable conviction of both. And they really needed that because there was nothing about this marriage that should have gone well. I mean, they had no affection. They didn't really know each other. He was 42. She was 26. They had both been in monasteries. They were both proud and arrogant. They didn't know how to live around other people except for people just like them because they were from monasteries and convents. And every external pressure you can imagine was brought to bear. He's always under the sentence of death. His own friends didn't like the idea that he got married. Philip Melanchthon wrote to him and said he believed somehow, he fell prey to Katerina's wiles, and he, fell into this. He was deceived. Even, it was really rich, even King Henry VIII in England, who would later go on to have unbelievable marital troubles, was writing against Luther. I think Erasmus of Rotterdam wrote something about the fact that Luther and Katerina were going to have a two-headed monster as a baby. I mean, it was just like everybody thought this was a bad deal, and they were pressuring them to go back to their former estates. And so nothing except this. What was the only thing that was right in their marriage was this, that they believed God put them together. And so what was the result of this? Well, Luther took a bit of time to adjust. I'm sure Katerina did as well. Luther wrote to Johann Dolzig, a friend of his, shortly after he was married, and he says, "Doubtless the outcry has reached your ears that I have actually ventured to enter the married state. Although my change of condition seems very strange to myself, being as scarcely yet able to believe it, still the fact is attested by so many honored witnesses that I must believe it to be true. So many people tell me I'm married, I must be married." He also said, he wrote to another friend, "I was alone, and now there's someone else here. In bed you wake up in the morning and see a couple of pigtails on your pillow." To another friend he declared, "God has suddenly and unexpectedly caught me in the bond of holy matrimony." And that's exactly what happened. And he believed it. And she believed it. And so here's what happened. She became an unbelievably excellent wife. She became an unbelievable wife. I don't know, one, how anybody could have put up with him. But beyond that, he lived in the Black Cloister, which was a monastery. And it was essentially vacant. That was his home, but all the monks were gone. And so she moved into the Black Cloister, and it was a very large place, and she turned it into a home. On their wedding night, the Peasants' War was raging, and refugees from the Peasants' War in great need came on their wedding night to the Black Cloister looking for Luther, and Luther and Katerina put them up, very emotional, and cared for them. You got to read these letters and things. It's so moving. Put them up, cared for, filled every one of the 40 cells in the entire monastery with people, and cared for them on their wedding night. This is the kind of thing that would happen throughout their ministry. I say their ministry because Luther could have never ministered the way he ministered without her. She turned that house into a home. If you ever have a chance, I've got it in the paper, read something called A Book of Husbandry. There was numerous books of husbandry written in the 16th century that describe what a wife's duties were in marriage. And I will tell you, every one of us are thankful that we're not a wife in the 16th century. The amount of work they had to do was unspeakably large. And Katerina had double that work because Luther entertained people constantly. Every time the plague came through, they turned the monastery into a hospital, and they cared for the sick. Luther one time wrote when the plague came through, "I'm your preacher and visitor to the sick," and Kate, the nurse, doctor, pharmacist, and counselor. And I'll tell you, Luther fell madly in love with Katerina, and Katerina madly in love with Martin. I say Luther, Martin. She was a Luther. And he became a great defender. In one instance, a couple of theologians wrote to the couple and said, "You need to go back to your former estates. You're going to experience the fires of hell," to which Luther responded, "I've entrusted your 2 letters to my servants who've taken them to the privy, who've used them as toilet paper." He just defended his wife all the time. Now, here's what's funny. At table talk, they would sit around the table with these students. Luther primarily would, and there'd be these theological conversations, and many funny things and serious things came out of those conversations. Kate was always present. In fact, it was called Kate's table. And at that table, Luther would harass his wife endlessly in ways that we would consider misogynistic and offensive, but it was totally playful. And she would give it right back to him. He'd say, he would say, "I can put up with my wife's temper because I've learned to put up with the devil." He would say these kinds of things, and then she would give it right back. But you can tell if you read enough of their material, or his material, that it was all playful. They just loved each other. And I'm going somewhere with all of this, but Luther held women in very high esteem and none higher than his Kate. He actually wrote at one point about women. This is really out of step for the age. He said, "One has to have women. If one does not have this sex, womankind, housekeeping and everything that pertains to it would fall apart." And he's like, well, there it is, housekeeping. Now listen to what he goes on to say. "And after it, all worldly governance, cities, and order. In sum, the world cannot dispense with women, even if men by themselves could bear children. Some good advice for our own age, I think. He says, you wouldn't have order in the world if you didn't have women. They bring order to everything. That's his point. And he trusted his wife with everything. They had business because they needed so many resources to produce his printed material, to send him all over, to entertain guests that would come through. He entrusted almost all the business decisions to his wife, theological matters as well. His most important, most famous work is Bondage of the Will. He was not going to write it in response to Erasmus of Rotterdam's Freedom of the Will, and Kate said, you have to write it. And she pressed him until he wrote that work. His most important work would have never been written had it not been for his wife. She was responsible for the printing and distribution of his materials. He even appointed her, whether it might rub Baptists the wrong way, to the head of a ministerial search committee to find ministers for pulpits. He trusted her with everything. And what you learn, probably the best place you see this in terms of his affection for his wife, and I'm really honed in on affection as part of companionship, you see this in his letters to her. He just writes these beautiful letters to her, and he's jesting a lot, but in the jesting, underneath the jesting, is this unbelievable respect he has for his wife. He writes a letter, for example, on October 4th, 1529. This is relatively early in their marriage. And here's the salutation. To my kind, dear Lord, Catherine Luther, a doctor and preacher in Wittenberg. Of course, she wasn't a doctor or a preacher, but he calls her a doctor and preacher in Wittenberg. Grace and peace in Christ, dear Sir Katie. And his valediction was similar. Your obedient servant, Martin Luther. He was playful with her, but that playfulness, there was something underneath, and that was this unbelievable respect Luther had for his wife. He loved his wife. In more serious moments, he would sign his letters off because he was traveling a lot. Martin Luther, who loves you from the heart. But let me read his last letter to her because it was the last thing he ever said to her. He was out of town when he died. She didn't want him to leave. He was ill. She'd prepared some medicinal things for him to take because he was ill, and he went to Eisleben, and he writes this letter back to her, and she's worried sick about him. He says, to the Holy Lady, full of worries, Miss Catherine Luther, doctor, the Lady of Zollsdorf at Wittenberg, my gracious dear mistress of the house, grace and peace in Christ, most holy Mrs. Doctor. I thank you very kindly for your great worry, which robs you of sleep. Since the date you started to worry about me, the fire in my quarters right outside the door of my room tried to devour me. And yesterday, no doubt, because of the strength of your worries, a stone almost fell on my head and nearly squashed me, as in a mousetrap. The stone was as big as a pillow and as wide as a large hand, and it intended to repay you for your holy worries had the dear angels not protected me. Now, I worry that if you do not stop worrying, the earth will finally swallow us up and the elements will chase us. Pray and let God worry. You have certainly not been commanded to worry about me or yourself. Cast your burdens on the Lord, and he will sustain you. With this I commend you to God, your holiness willing servant, Martin Luther. And that was the last she would hear of him. What's interesting, long before he ever got married, or even before he was excommunicated from the Roman Catholic Church, he had written this about marriage. He said, God makes distinctions between different kinds of love. But over and above all these is married love, that is, a bride's love, which glows like a fire and desires nothing but the husband. She says, it is you I want, not what is yours. I want neither your silver nor your gold. I want neither. I want only you. I want you in your entirety or not at all. All other kinds of love seek something but the loved one. This kind wants only to have the beloved's own self completely. What's amazing is he wrote that in 1519. And that's the love he would come into and experience, and so would Kate. And it's a wonderful, wonderful story. Now, in the paper, I just add a little blurb at the end of each of these sections with a lesson. What can we learn? Well, there's many lessons in their marriage, much more than I drew out. But here's one of the lessons that is so important in our age. Lifelong commitment is not the fruit of passionate affection. You don't get married because of affection, and you don't stay married because of affection. It's lifelong commitment that produces and cultivates affection. It's a decision of the will based on what you believe God has designed that gives you the roots you need and the commitment you need. And if you genuinely believe that, that will flower into affection. And that's something that is more evident in this marriage than any marriage I've ever read about. It's a remarkable thing. So part of companionship is this deeply rooted commitment and belief that God has designed you specifically as companions in marriage. And then that will give rise to this affection. Okay, Richard and Margaret Baxter. I'm going to cover these last two much more quickly, but they're beautiful stories. Almost 100 years, 98 years after Luther posted his 95 Theses, a man was born in England by the name of Richard Baxter. And Richard would go on to become a great preacher and a prolific author, one of the most prolific authors in church history. Just a remarkable amount of material came from his pen. But in 1641, he started preaching in a town called Kidderminster, which was notorious for being a rough and ungodly town. And he preached there 19 years until 1660, and by the time he left, that was one of the most godly towns in England, if not Europe. It was an unbelievable transformation that occurred in this town. And one of the transformations that occurred is in 1657, 3 years before his ministry there is done, a very young lady, much younger than him, moves to Kidderminster. She's wealthy. She's a very wealthy young lady with a grand estate, and she also was very vain. And she sits under his preaching and comes under the conviction of his preaching, of God's word, essentially, and gives her life to the Lord and became an unbelievably serious Christian lady. Richard Baxter, at the end of his life, they would ultimately marry. He writes her memoirs, and the first portion of those memoirs are just large excerpts from her own diary. And they are beautiful. I mean, it just reveals the depth of faith and commitment this young lady had. Well, anyway, she's there under his preaching. She becomes a Christian. He's done preaching in 1660. He built a wonderful relationship with her. And Baxter held marriage in very high regard. He had written a number of things on marriage and would go on to write a number of things. One of the greatest works he wrote was called the Christian Directory. It's a monumental work. And in it, there's a section entitled Christian Economics. You ever remember the classes Home Economics, which are long gone now? Well, this is Christian Economics. It's sort of how the family is to be structured and what the family should look like. And in that, he asked this question. He says, how should a man know whether God calls him to marriage? And here's his answer, although he goes on for pages about this. He says, another cause that warranteth marriage is this: when upon a wise casting up of all accounts, it is apparently most probable that in a married state one may be most serviceable to God and the public good. Do you remember what Ecclesiastes said, two are better than one because they get a good return for their labor? Baxter is saying something similar. He says, if it be clear that in a married state you have better advantages for the service of God and doing good to others, then it is undoubtedly your duty to marry. Marriage, in part, this companionship is designed that we may be more serviceable to God together than we could be alone. And Baxter makes much of this. He also says this. He says, be sure that God be the ultimate end of your marriage, and that you principally choose that state of life, that in it you may be most serviceable to Him, and that you heartily devote yourselves and your families to God. And so he keeps saying, marriage is about serving God and glorifying God and serving others. That's one of the ends of marriage, ultimately glorifying God. But how do you do this? You serve Him in your marriage and you serve others in your marriage. And we should be more serviceable together than we would be apart. And certainly this would be true for Baxter. But Baxter, although he has this high view of marriage, he's not interested in marriage in his case because he really believed that ministers most often should not get married because they need to be completely sold out and available to ministry. For example, in his particular case in Kidderminster, he had 800 families in that church, something like that. It was a remarkable number. And he was in every one of their homes at least once a year. That's a staggering amount, plus all of his preaching, all of his writing. And he also said that ministers ought to be willing to give everything, every physical material possession you have up, if necessary, for the service of God. And he says, how practical is that if you have a family? So he did not believe marriage was for him, even though he had this really high view of marriage. Well, what happened ultimately is this. In 1660, he's done preaching in Kidderminster. He moves to London. He's offered a bishopric, which would have brought lots of wealth and prestige, but he turns it down. There was a lot of political turmoil in Britain at the time. They were moving from a republic to a monarchy. And what ended up happening is he turned the bishopric down. The new king essentially was installed. Parliament passed something called the Act of Uniformity. The Act of Uniformity said if you're going to be a minister in England, you've got to subscribe to a whole series of things that were obnoxious to Puritans. For example, the king is the head of the church, where the Puritans would say, no, Christ is the head of the church. So there were a whole series of things they would have to subscribe to. So Baxter said, I will not subscribe to the Act of Uniformity. He and 2,000 other ministers endured what was called the Great Ejection. They lost their livings, they lost their churches, and they were out. And so Baxter, a preacher, had no prospect of making a living. He knew what this meant. He was going to be harassed all of his life. And Margaret still wanted to marry him. And so he writes, some of my dissuading reasons for marriage is simply the fact that I'm a minister, and now I don't have a pulpit, I don't have a church. Those were removed, and so they were finally wed. They got married. Now, she was much younger than him. She was some 20 years younger than Richard Baxter. But they went ahead and married. Now, he said, if you're going to marry me, there's a concession. There's multiple concessions, but one of them is this. I never want to be accused of marrying you for your money, so you cannot bring your wealth into our marriage. And that was a big ask, because this man was likely to be persecuted relentlessly if he tried to preach anywhere. And she did that. She agreed to that and a number of other things. So she would be able to use her wealth to advance Christian ministry, but she would not bring it into their marriage. And Richard writes about this. He writes this. He says, another trial of her, he's writing about his wife, another trial of her as to wealth and honor was when I and all such others were cast out of all possession and hope of all ecclesiastical maintenance. She was not ignorant of the scorn and jealousies, the wrath and prosecutions that I was likely to be exposed to. To choose a participation of such a life that had no encouragement from any worldly wealth or honor, yea, that was exposed to such certain suffering which had no end in prospect on this side of death, did show that she was far from covetous. This young lady was a wealthy lady. She had come from a high family. She gave it all up to marry a man that she knew was going to make her life, she was going to suffer. And she suffered. And he suffered. But they had this glorious companionship in marriage. To give you sort of a summary of what their marriage looked like, he lived as a virtual fugitive. They would be in a place, they'd be paying rent, then they wouldn't secure, he would be preaching, which was essentially illegal. He'd be found out and they'd be forced to move, or they wouldn't be able to pay rent, and the landlord would cast them out, and they just were constantly moving from place to place. In one place, they found this family of a farmer had a single room they rented. It had a chimney, and it was in the middle of winter, and Richard said it was a brutally cold winter. And he said that chimney just poured smoke, coal smoke, into the room. And he said it was so cold, and we would sit in there in a virtual cloud of coal smoke. And he said it just disturbed her health. It was that the health problems were relentless. And he said, yet she was such a blessing to that farmer's family. He got thrown in prison at one point. She went with him, and he said she went with me cheerfully. Probably because it was the only stable place they ever stayed. They just were moved around, and all of her life was like this. And now what she would do is she would try to use her wealth to advance the gospel. So in one place, they finally moved to London at one point, and she couldn't find clandestinely a place for her husband to preach. So she has all this wealth, so she has a little chapel built where he can preach. He preached there once. The authorities found out. They came the next day to arrest him, but he had traveled some 20 miles to preach somewhere else, so she had secured another meek minister to preach the gospel that day. They arrested that minister, thinking it was Richard, and threw him in jail. And now Margaret, her husband away, no communication like we have, has to go and find an attorney and go pay fines and get this fellow released. And she does. Well, the next day, the authorities were watching the chapel, and Richard Baxter was never able to preach there again. She built a chapel that her husband could preach in it once. She found another chapel, had it restored. He was able to preach there 3 or 4 months clandestinely before the authorities found out, and he could no longer come back. She built yet another chapel, and he was there just a bit before he was moved off. And this is the kind of thing that just happened throughout their marriage. And it was interesting because he was threatened. Every time he was caught preaching, he was fined 40 pounds, which in our currency would be something like today, $10,000. And he showed some resistance to that. He was telling his wife, I ought not do that. And he said, she had no stomach to hear that I would not preach the gospel because of a fine, even an unbelievable fine that would ensure that they were impoverished and would remain impoverished. And so she was just an unbelievable companion to Richard. Now, he writes this about her. He says she was tyrannized by fear. She was a very fearful lady. He says she much dreamed of fire and murders. I mean, how could you not in that day? But she much dreamed of fire and murders, and her own dreams worked half as dangerously on her as realities, so that she could not bear the clapping of a door or anything that had suddenness, noise, or fierceness to it. But he also writes this about her. She was more fearless of persecution, imprisonment, or losses in poverty than I or any that I remember to have known. This lady was afraid of everything except being persecuted for the gospel. He says, I've never known anybody like her. And so he writes this about his beautiful wife. He says, I was not the perfect husband. He writes this after her death. He says, my writings and preachings and other public duty did so wholly take up those few hours of the day which I had out of my bed that I was seldomer in secret prayer with my wife than she desired. She thought I should have spent more time in religious exercise with her, my family, and my neighbors, though I had written less. He later added, oh, this is so beautiful. He says, my dear wife did look for more good in me and more help from me than she found, especially lately in my weakness and decay. We are all like pictures that must not be looked on too near. They that come near us find more faults and badness in us than others know at a distance. But here's his description of his summary of their love. We lived in inviolate love and mutual complacency, mutual pleasure, sensible of the benefit of mutual help, this being serviceable to God together. These near 19 years I've known that not that we ever had any breach in point of love or point of interest, save only that she somewhat grudged me that I had persuaded her for my quietness to surrender so much of her estate. Now, what he's saying is she begrudged him for giving up so much of her estate, not so they could live better, but she lamented the fact that she couldn't keep a nicer home because she thought it would be better for their ministry, his ministry to other people. The fact that they were constantly being moved around made it difficult. And so she wanted more money so she could spend it to make ministry more effective. And so he mentions that. Well, she dies, and he dies 10 years later. And he wrote the memoirs of Mrs. Margaret Baxter. That's the title of it. An absolutely very slender little work, very moving. It's not a chronological account. You might say it's something of a thematic account of their marriage. And it is absolutely beautiful. And I really recommend it. Here's the point. Assuming both husband and wife are deeply committed to biblical priorities, Christian marriage provides the opportunity to be more serviceable together than you could ever be on your own. And their marriage is a wonderful, and in fact, every one of these marriages is a wonderful picture of that. You know what they had? They had tell us the same end. They were working together to a common end. And in their case, Richard preached, and she found places for him to preach and others to preach, and they worked together to that end, and it was amazing. Finally, I'm just going to mention a word or two about Charles and Susanna Spurgeon, another remarkable marriage. I won't spend much time introducing you to Spurgeon. There's more material published by Spurgeon than any other Christian author, period. something like 63 volumes of sermons. There's 150 books. He was just an unbelievably prolific, with his letters and different things he wrote in his sword and trowel, and I mean on and on and on. He just wrote and wrote and wrote and preached and preached and preached. And in fact, he preached much more than we know, because he was preaching early in his ministry some 12 times a week, and only one of those was being published. So, only 1/12 of his early sermons were being actually published. Nevertheless, he comes into a very famous church, New Park Street Chapel. Later, it had great Puritans at the pulpit for many years, and he comes in as a very young man, and everybody's impressed except for one Susanna Thompson, who was unimpressed with Charles. But then husbands, he did the thing you need to do if you want to impress your wives or your fiance. He gave her a copy of John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, because he loved the book and she struggled with assurance, and he gave it to her. And it seems that was sort of that's where love sparked. And they fell in love with one another, and they were ultimately married. And I'm not going to spend any time really telling you, all that they did. I will say, just in summary, Susie and Charles and Susie at his side, not only was she instrumental in his sermons, and I'll go into that in a moment, he published The Sword and Trowel, which was a monthly publication. He set up a pastor's college, and they would have students in their home around their table. And she was engaged in many of those conversations. They set up the Metropolitan Maternal Society for the Aid of Destitute Mothers. They set up the Stockwell Orphanage, and in fact 2 orphanages. He planted 200 churches, and he established a book fund that she managed to get materials into the hands of poor pastors. Susie, in fact, wrote a book called 10 Years with the Book Fund, My Experience in God's Work, in his ways and work. It's a remarkable book, because in the book, she's talking about her experience managing the book fund, and there's all these letters from pastors who received materials that would not have otherwise received materials, and how much it changed their lives and their ministries. It was beautiful. So she was instrumental in all of this. And Charles, he had a high view of marriage, obviously. He held the Puritan view of marriage, the same purposes for marriage. But he wrote this about marriage, talking about our being united, one flesh. He says this: how can we call that marriage where the husband and wife are still 2 persons, maintaining individuality as if it were a scrupulous condition of the contract? That is utterly foreign to the divine idea. In a true marriage, the husband and wife become one. Henceforth, their joys and their cares, their hopes and their labors, their sorrows and their pleasures rise and blend together in one stream. And then he adds this. He says, the very crown of marriage is mutual delight and complacency. Again, pleasure. Mutual delight and pleasure in one another is the crown of marriage. And they would share all of it, joy and sorrow, they hope and despair, unremitting labor, and unbelievable delight in their marriage. And you might ask how, because everything in their marriage militated against them having a good marriage. He struggled with melancholy, which is severe depression, all of his life. She was, within about 10 years of their marriage, was homebound, almost never went to church, often bedbound with health issues. He was almost never home, traveling all the time preaching. And when he was home, often he was just busy. He would reply in a letter to like 500 letters a week. I mean, that's unimaginable to me. He would do this on top of all of his other duties. And then later, there was the downgrade controversy where he's basically battling liberalism, and he's greatly depressed over this. And so they had all of these difficulties. I mean, lots and lots and lots of difficulties, and he's not home, and she's homebound. And you ask, how in the world could they have such a wonderful marriage? Because they both said they did. And you start to look at their devotional life when they are together. They had a wonderful, absolutely wonderful devotional life. Let me just read a couple of excerpts from her. There's a 4-volume autobiography published about Charles, and there's huge excerpts that are just written by her about her marriage. So on a Saturday night, Charles would, the Lord would give Charles a text for the next morning, and he would write his sermon on Saturday night. Anybody that's ever done that, I'm sure some of you men have, that is not a pleasurable experience. But Charles this was his routine. So here's what she writes about this. For some time it has been the dear pastor's custom, she's obviously referring to her husband, as soon as the text for the Lord's Day morning service has been given him by the master, to call me into the study and permit me to read the various commentaries on the subject matter at hand. There come delightful pauses in my reading when the book is laid down and I listen to the dear voice of my beloved as he explains what I cannot understand or unfolds meanings which I fail to see, often condensing into a few clear, choice sentences, whole pages of those discursive old divines in whom he delights, and pressing from all the gathered thoughts all the richest nectar of their hidden sweetness. And then he adds this about this experience with her husband. How shall I sufficiently thank God for this drink of the brook by the way, this holy place within my home, where the Lord deigns to meet with me and draw out my heart in adoration and worship. So that's Saturday night. Well, what's Sunday night look like? She tells us, you imagine, I don't know about you, but when you're a minister, I worked for John Deere for many years, and I'd come home exhausted. Never as exhausted as coming home after a Sunday. I don't know what it is, spiritual warfare, I'm not sure what it is, just people pressing on you. Can you imagine Charles Spurgeon, thousands and thousands of people, multiple sermons, the world's cares just being inundated every Sunday? It's unimaginable. And a man who struggled with depression. And Susie writes this, when he would come home on Sunday night, shall I read to you, dear? Will you have a page or two of good George Herbert, a 17th century poet and clergyman? Yes, that will be very refreshing, wifey. I shall like that. He always called her wifey. I shall like that. So the book is procured, and he chooses a section, which I read slowly with many pauses, that he may interpret to me the sweet mysteries hidden in the gracious words. I read on and on for an hour or more, till the peace of heaven flows into our souls, and the servant of the King of Kings loses his sense of fatigue and rejoices after his toil. And then she says, another Sabbath night, the scene is somewhat changed in character. I read page after page of such solemn pleadings, interrupted now and again by his stifled heart sobs, till my voice will fail, till my voice fails from emotion and sympathy. My eyes grow dim and my tears mingle with his as we weep together. He from the smitings of a very tender conscience toward God, and I simply and only because I love him and want to share his grief. They would read together, they would pray together, they would talk together, they would sing together. He quoted in one of his works Matthew Henry, who had once said, the family who prays does well, they who read and pray do better, and they who sing and read and pray do best of all. And they would do all of it. And they had this absolutely beautiful marriage from this deep commitment to Christ and this belief that God had put them together. They not only had this great affection flow out of that, they were more serviceable to God together than they could have ever been by themselves. And all of that was sustained by an unbelievable devotional life, even though it wasn't regular. When they were together, it was remarkable. And so you have these beautiful marriages. Why do I mention all of this? Because this is what biblical companionship in part looks like. It starts with this deeply rooted commitment, this belief that we've been given to one another, our spouse, husband and wife, and a true heartfelt commitment that we've been given to one another. And that commitment works itself out in glorious ways, in affection. It works itself out in having a common end for your marriage where you work together and you're serviceable to God in unbelievable, unspeakable ways. And it's sustained by a beautiful devotional life because you care. You see how much she cared about the weight her husband endured. And she says elsewhere how he was always encouraging her and comforting her in her bodily, her physical ailments. They cared for one another. And so I just think, praise the Lord for examples. So with that, let's pray together. Heavenly Father, thank you for this time together. We thank you most of all for your word, Lord, which teaches us about marriage. It's inerrant and infallible. Lord, examples in marriage are not. These aren't perfect marriages or perfect people. And yet, Lord, you give us many examples, both in your word and across history, Lord, that we can look to help us. And we thank you for these examples. And Lord, may some of this be present in our own marriages. May we really enjoy biblical companionship, that deeply rooted commitment to one another, Lord, believing that you put us together. And Lord, what you put together, no one should take apart. And we thank you for the blessings, the fruit that flows from that commitment. And so we just ask you, Lord, may the rest of this conference be a blessing to all present. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.